The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service here at Gettysburg. My name is Brooke Diaz, and I work for the Gettysburg Foundation. And over the years, as we've presented Sacred Trust, we've had the great honor of hosting nationally renowned Civil War authors, historians, National Park Service rangers, and licensed battlefield guides so that they can share their unique perspectives on the Battle of Gettysburg and the Civil War with you, our visitors. And this year is no difference. Coming up next, Richard M. McMurry will present Atlanta, 1864, the campaign that re-elected Lincoln. Early in September 1864 came word that Lincoln's army in Georgia had gained a great victory that guaranteed the president's re-election, preservation of the Union, and the end of slavery. That victory was the capture of Atlanta. Richard McMurry has taught history at Valdosta State College and North Carolina State University, a freelance writer and speaker. He is the author of numerous books and essays related to the Great Conflict. He has received the Fletcher Pratt Award, Nevins Freeman Award, and the Charles L. Dufour Award. A member of the Civil War Trust and the Organization of American Historians, he travels the United States speaking at many universities, civic clubs, and literary societies. Please join me in welcoming Richard M. McMurry.
Thank you so much. I am always glad to get back here on the eastern periphery of the war, trying to spread the true gospel among the heathen. When the Lord puts his hand on your shoulder and says, go forth into the wilderness with a small w and preach the true gospel of the Civil War, you have to go where the heathen are. And when it comes to understanding the military history of the Civil War, most of the heathens seem to live east of the Blue Ridge. If you go back and look at the military history of the war, it really took place in three great geographical areas. Way out here west of the Mississippi River, the area called the Trans-Mississippi, went all the way to the Pacific Ocean from the Mississippi River. A fascinating area, but essentially not that crucial in the Civil War. You know, once the status of Missouri had been settled, there wasn't that much more going on out there. The second part was east of the Appalachian Mountains, in the area of Virginia, Maryland, northeastern North Carolina, and as we know here, southern Pennsylvania. The third part was that part in the middle, between the Mississippi River on the west, over here on the west, and the Appalachian Mountains on the east. The area of Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. That area in the 1860s was known as the West. And there were great battles that took place in all three of those areas. But I believe the really crucial engagements so far as determining the outcome of the war went, the military outcome, was that part that took place between the Mississippi and the Appalachians in the West. The war over here in Virginia was essentially a stalemate that went on from the beginning to the end. The reason for that, if you want one word, is Lee. In Virginia, the Confederates were not strong enough to win, but as long as Robert E. Lee lived, they were too smart to lose. If the war had still been going on, you people up here in Pennsylvania would be saying, golly, I hope we can beat Lee this summer. I mean, that old man's been beating up on us for 152 years now. But they couldn't. The Federal Army was too strong to lose, but the Federal generals in Virginia were not smart enough to win. And the result was a stalemate in which neither army could gain the great victory that would determine the outcome of the war. We heard last hour about the Battle of the Monocacy and how Lee was able to maneuver and get Grant to detach a very large part of his army from the lines at Petersburg and Richmond to send up to Washington when Early threatened that city in July of 1864. But Early didn't capture Washington. Grant did not capture Richmond then. Those armies remained essentially where they had been all during the war, within a small area, within 100, 150, 200 miles of Richmond. And while they were doing that, it was in the West that the war changed significantly. Union armies in the West went from victory to victory. They overran states, they captured cities, they compelled Confederate armies to surrender. And the result was that by 1865, the Union Army that had been in Cairo, Illinois, and St. Louis, and Cincinnati, and Louisville in 1861 had been down through Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, across Georgia to Savannah, and had turned up through the Carolinas and was in Raleigh, North Carolina. That was the Western theater of the war. And it was in response to that that Lee detached the equivalent of a corps from his army in late 1864 and 1865 and sent them south to try to block that, weakening his army and leading to the capture of Richmond and Petersburg. So it's in this western area that this great Union success that began in September 1861 took place. And it went on in a virtually unbroken line for the entire war. The Confederacy began losing the war in September 1861, and it went right on losing it until the end in April 1865. We missed that, looking at it, because we tend to focus on what happened here in the East. And if you look at the East, you get a very misleading picture of the war. By late 1863, the Union armies in the West had achieved two great strategic successes. One, they had opened the Mississippi River from its source up in Minnesota to its mouth in the Louisiana Delta. The Mississippi River was back under Union control, divided the Confederacy almost literally in half. The second great success, the one that we're more concerned with here, came when the Union armies moved the line between the North and South from the Ohio River, where it was at the beginning, all the way south to the Tennessee River, which runs in East Tennessee down across northern Alabama and then back up through Kentucky, bringing all of Kentucky and almost all of Tennessee back under Union control. This meant that by the beginning of 1864, the Union armies were poised for the ultimate victory, the end of the war, if they could continue winning this kind of objective. But there was a problem. 1864 was a presidential election year. No incumbent president had been elected for a second term since Andrew Jackson in 1832. No incumbent president had even been nominated for a second term since Martin Van Buren in 1836. It was not at all foreordained that Lincoln would be nominated in 1864 or that he would be reelected if he were. He had to have a military victory. So in 1864, when Ulysses S. Grant was named commander of all the Union armies, Grant planned to conduct 5 great campaigns designed to stamp out or squish out the Confederacy. One of these campaigns would be along the Gulf Coast, starting over here in New Orleans. I'm sorry, I have to do this backwards. You'll have to, I'm trying to look at a map from the back, so you'll have, over here in New Orleans, would move along the Gulf Coast to Mobile, Alabama. That would take away the last significant Confederate port on the Gulf of Mexico. More significantly, it would break the rail line between central Mississippi and western Alabama, And even more significantly still, it would cut off the Confederate government in Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia from the breadbasket of the Confederacy. If you have been propagandized by what has been called the Virginia cult, you refer to the Shenandoah Valley as the breadbasket of Virginia. I'm sorry, the breadbasket of the Confederacy. It was not. It might have been the breadbasket of Virginia, but I guarantee you very few Confederate soldiers in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, Louisiana ever ate bread made with wheat grown in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. They ate bread with wheat grown in the Tombigbee River Valley in western Alabama and eastern Mississippi. That was the breadbasket of the Confederacy, and if you don't believe me, ask Jefferson Davis. Because early in 1864, Jefferson Davis was writing about the Confederate strategic situation. And Alabama, the Tombigbee Valley, is our great source of supplies. And he was right. You take Mobile, you break the one railroad link between the Tombigbee Valley in the west and Lee's army and the civilian population in Richmond in the east. Not only could that campaign from New Orleans to Mobile do that, it could also then turn and go up into Alabama to Selma, north of Mobile, which was the great munitions and industrial complex of the Confederacy. Take that and you wipe out a large part of the Confederacy's industrial ability to carry on the war. So that was one campaign. New Orleans to Mobile to Selma, then on, who knows, Montgomery, Atlanta, who knew? Second campaign was to take place in the Shenandoah Valley in western Virginia. A small Union army led by Franz Sigel, you know, I goes to fight mit Sigel, was to march up the Shenandoah Valley, south. Up and down is determined by a river. River flows down, so you march up the Shenandoah Valley going south to come into that area, occupy that, cut off the Federal Army from whatever supplies it would get in the Shenandoah Valley. Third campaign was down in southeastern Virginia. Benjamin Butler, Beast Butler, Spoons Butler, every New Orleanian's favorite Civil War general, would lead an army up the peninsula in eastern Virginia against Richmond and Petersburg. Those, in fact, were peripheral campaigns, auxiliary campaigns almost, as it were. The main campaign would come in Georgia and in Virginia. The one in Virginia would be directed by Grant, who would move with the Army of the Potomac against Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. The one in Georgia would be directed by Grant's good friend and trusted lieutenant, William Tecumseh Sherman, every Atlantean's favorite Civil War general. Those were to be the main campaigns. Very early on, this Union plan to launch these 5 campaigns ran into problems. This campaign from New Orleans to Mobile had to be scrapped because of Confederate victories in the Red River Valley of western Louisiana. Confederates were suddenly threatening New Orleans. You couldn't strip New Orleans of defensive troops. That campaign was scrapped. The campaign in the Shenandoah Valley had to be terminated because of a Confederate victory at the Battle of Newmarket, where the Corps of Cadets from the Virginia Military Institute defeated an invading Union Army. I'm a VMI alumnus, so I have to put it that way, although I will admit that they had some help from Confederate Army units that happened to be in the area. But Sigel's campaign came to grief. Third campaign down in southeastern Virginia, Benjamin Butler. Confederate troops rushed up from the Carolinas, drove Butler back into Bermuda Hundred, and in Grant's picturesque, if not quite accurate phrase, bottled him up there. 3 of the 5 campaigns have come to nothing. Confederates have won. They're 3 for 3. Grant led the Army of the Potomac into the wilderness to fight Lee. And they waged a titanic series of battles. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor, Petersburg. By the time Grant's army reeled back from the first assaults on Richmond and Petersburg in mid-June and July, Grant's army had lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80,000 men. No large American army has ever been beaten up like that. And as we heard last hour, Lee was so secure, he sent part of his army under Jubal Early way off into the Shenandoah Valley, down the valley, across the Potomac, into Maryland, rout a Union army at the Monocacy, threaten Washington, burn Chambersburg. This doesn't sound like Union military success. And it wasn't. That left only one campaign that could save the Union in 1864. It was so bad in 1864 that accusations had been made that the Federal War Department deliberately falsified casualty reports from Grant's army, so people would not know how bad it was. And those of you who were here last hour, someone asked the speaker, why didn't Grant attack Lee at Richmond and Petersburg when Early was in Maryland threatening Washington and in Pennsylvania burning Chambersburg? The answer he gave, and I think he's right, is that Grant's army had been beaten to a pulp and it would not have made an attack on the Confederate fortifications at Richmond and Petersburg. That left only this one campaign in Georgia. The campaign in Georgia was a fairly simple thing. The Union Army, roughly 110,000 men at the start of the campaign, commanded by William Sherman. Confederate Army, roughly 55,000 at the start of the campaign, reinforced to about 75 or 80,000 as the campaign went on, waged a campaign of maneuver. Well, the Union Army waged a campaign of maneuver. The Confederate Army waged a campaign of sitzkrieg. The Confederate commander, Joseph E. Johnston, would take up a strong position on some ridge or mountain, fortify it, and sit in it, hoping that his opponents under Sherman would attack it. Sherman would march up, reconnoiter, skirmish around, find out how strong Johnston's position was, and then march off to the west and come around south of Johnston to threaten the railroad to Atlanta. Whereupon Johnston would retreat 15 or 20 miles, take up a strong position, fortify it, sit in it, hope Sherman would attack, and the whole process would be repeated. All the way back from Dalton to Resaca to Calhoun to Adairsville to Cassville to Allatoona to New Hope Church to Kennesaw Mountain to Smyrna to the Chattahoochee River to Peachtree Creek. Same pattern. I'm not going to go into details on this. There's a wonderful book on it called Atlanta 1864 that everybody should buy and read. Well, truth be told, I don't care if you read it. What this meant, and the Confederate government was very much aware of this, was that Johnston's withdrawal had exposed all of that area, particularly in Alabama and eastern Mississippi that I had talked about, to capture or occupation. If you look at a map, and I suppose if I were computer literate, I would have something up here where you could see this, but I'm not. I can't even do email. First place, I'm bored by computers. And in the second place, I'm a stamp collector, and I'd be like Benedict Arnold if I started doing email. A friend told me she was going to teach me to use a computer. I said, Judy, you'd have better luck teaching an earthworm to fly the space shuttle. I have problems operating doorknobs. But if you look at a map, the Chattahoochee River starts way up here in northeastern Georgia, flows down north of Atlanta, gets to the border between Georgia and Alabama and turns and flows south. In fact, it becomes the border between Georgia and Alabama. And when Johnston retreated across that river, he frightened the Confederate government. Said Sherman might not continue after Johnston and after Atlanta. Sherman might instead turn and go down the Chattahoochee River all the way to Apalachicola, Florida, on the Gulf of Mexico. And if he did that, he would cut off the Tombigbee Valley, Mobile, Montgomery, Selma from the rest of the country. It reduced the Confederacy to central and south Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, and part of Virginia. Sherman didn't do that. We know he didn't even seriously consider it, but he could have done it. And the Confederate government did not know that he was not going to do it. The Confederate government was just absolutely panicked. Then in mid-July, this had frightened the Confederate government so much that President Jefferson Davis sent Joseph E. Johnston, with whom he had had serious disagreements since the very beginning of the war, sent Joseph E. Johnston a telegram. I wish to hear from you as to your situation and your plans so specifically as will enable me to anticipate events. Johnston's reply was so vague that it was almost meaningless. Whereupon Davis took the step that he had been considering for some time. He removed Johnston from command, and he replaced him with John Bell Hood, one of his corps commanders. Hood's a fascinating fellow. He had been wounded here at Gettysburg on July 2nd in his left arm, you know, down there at the far southern end of the battlefield where his men were going into battle. And he apparently was waving them like this, and an artillery shell exploded up there about the top of the tent, and a piece of it came down his arm. Did some damage to the arm, but not as much as we previously thought. By the way, if you're not aware of it, a cache of John Bell Hood papers has recently surfaced and is being published, things that nobody has seen in 100 and some odd years. They belong to some old fellow in Pennsylvania here who apparently is more of a hermit and a recluse and a misanthrope than I am. And he's lived in isolation with these things, but he finally called up a collateral descendant of Hood and released them. Contains, among other things, about a 15-page handwritten medical record of Hood from the doctor who treated him after he lost a leg in September 1863. It is detailed. If it weren't so soon after the lunch hour, I might tell you how detailed it is. But those of you who are not medical doctors don't want to know how detailed. Trust me on that. If you get the book and read it, don't read this thing within 6 hours of a meal, either before or after. But it will tell you how just detailed. And the crucial thing, Hood has been accused of being hooked on drugs. The only drugs mentioned in this report, 1/4 grain, not gram, grain of morphine, always at night, always to help him get to sleep for about 2 months. After his leg was amputated, then it stopped. He was not hooked on drugs. Anyway, in July 1864, he took command of the Confederate Army at Atlanta. Within 10 days after he took command, Hood reversed Johnston's policies. Johnston had been pursuing a passive campaign. Sit, wait for the Federals to do something. Hood seized the initiative. He put the Federal Army at Atlanta on the defensive. And within 10 days, he had fought 3 battles with the Union Army around Atlanta. Think about a clock with Atlanta at the center. On the first battle, July 20th at Peachtree Creek, up around 10 or 11 o'clock, Hood attacked the Union Army. 2 days later, out around 3 o'clock, on the eastern side of Atlanta. He struck again, and on July 28th at 9 o'clock, he fought the Battle of Ezra Church west of Atlanta. In all three of those battles, Hood failed in his major objective, which was to inflict a great battlefield defeat on Sherman's army that would force Sherman to retreat. If you look at what Hood did, as it has traditionally been viewed, Hood failed. He did take somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 casualties total in the three battles. But if you look at what he planned to do, as opposed to what actually happened, it turned out, as even his Union opponents admitted, his plans were often brilliant. The problem was the execution of the plans, not the plan. At Peachtree Creek, for example, he planned to strike into a gap in the Union lines, wheel to the west, and drive the Union Army back against the Chattahoochee River. What actually happened was the division commander who was supposed to do that went into the gap and turned to the east. That wasn't Hood's fault. It was the guy's name was William Bate. It was his fault. Men sent out to make attacks on the Union Army attacked piecemeal. They launched unauthorized attacks. The Army of Tennessee was rotten in the command structure. And again, there's a good book on this called Two Great Rebel Armies. It was just absolutely rotten in the command structure. These people were incompetent. I can't explain it. I don't know why all the incompetent Confederate generals wound up in the Army of Tennessee. Maybe it was the drinking water. Who knows? When I had students from that area, it could well have been the drinking water. But for some reason, they failed even to execute the orders they were given. What would have happened if they'd followed the plan? We don't know. We just don't know. But the result of Hood's three battles was to force Sherman to stop. After July, Sherman sat there for about 6 weeks trying to figure out what to do. Johnston had never held a position that long. Hood did. And all this time, remember, you're in the summer of 1864. The election is getting closer. Lincoln's critics among the Democrats and among the Republicans are getting more and more shrill in what they say. The pressure on Lincoln to do things like repeal the Emancipation Proclamation became very strong. The Democrats waged what has been called one of the most racist campaigns in American history in 1864, attacking Lincoln. And even some of Lincoln's Republican supporters went to him and said, Mr. President, you've got to throw out the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln said, no, if it's done, it will have to be by some hand other than mine. And even Lincoln, as late as late August, predicted that his administration would not be reelected in November 1864. Finally, Sherman, in late August, came up with what amounted to a kind of desperate idea. He would take his army up here around Atlanta, leave a part of it, one corps, the 20th Corps, to hold the bridgehead over the Chattahoochee River. Take the rest of it, go way out, so far out Hood couldn't get at him. Go way out around the west side of Atlanta and come in way south of Atlanta at Jonesboro, where he would get on the one railroad that Johnston had left intact that still supplied the army at Atlanta. Hood rushed 2/3 of his army down there to deal with this. And on August 31st, they made an attack on Sherman, and they made it piecemeal. The commanders on the battlefield lost control of their troops, and the attack was defeated. The railroad was cut, and the Confederates had to evacuate Atlanta. That was when Scarlett and Rhett and Prissy and Melanie's baby had to get in that wagon, and Atlanta was a-burning, and they fled the city. Hood got blamed for all of this. You know, this is the impression that a number of motion pictures, television shows have created, that Hood is responsible for this. You know, it is hard to convince people that something they see in a motion picture or on television is not true. I had an interesting experience along these lines when I was teaching at North Carolina State. There was a wonderful movie made back, I believe, in the late 1950s called On the Beach. One or two of you look like you might be old enough to have seen it. But for those of you who have not, or did not, it's set in Australia in the aftermath of World War III. The United States and the Soviet Union have shot off all their atomic bombs, and they have killed everybody on Earth except the people in Australia. And those blokes are down there drinking beer, singing Waltzing Matilda, and waiting for this radioactive cloud which is slowly drifting down toward them. It's a good movie. It's well worth seeing. But it spawned a whole genre of movies like that. You know, this was the height of the Cold War. The Russians had gotten the atomic bomb. You know, the war was going to break out at any moment. If you were in school then, you practiced getting under your desk in case the Russians dropped a hydrogen bomb on the school. You know, get under there waiting for the hydrogen bomb to come. It was just all that was going on. But that passed. But they made more movies like that, and they made one in the 1980s called The Day After, set in Indiana, Kansas, somewhere. Same thing, everybody's dying of radiation sickness. I had students see that, and they would come up and say, God, it must have been awful being alive in the 1950s. What do you mean? You live your whole life under this mushroom cloud threat. You know, your life will be snuffed out in an atomic blast while you're trying to figure out 2x equals 10, what does x equal in algebra class. So what was it like thinking about that? I'd go off to school in the morning, you'd never see your family. What was it like thinking about that all the time? I said, I have no earthly idea. I didn't think about that. I mean, I'm sure there were people who thought about things like that, but I was not one of them. I said, oh, what did you think about when you were in high school? I said, I thought about this scenario. It began 800 million years ago when there was a massive rupture of the cosmic continuum way out on the other side of the Big Dipper. And as a result of that, this gigantic killer asteroid was jarred out of its normal orbit around the star Alpha Centauri and sent flying off on an elliptical intergalactic trajectory that in 1955 brought it hurtling into the solar system, where it bounced off the planet Pluto. Pluto was a planet in 1955. It bounced off the planet Pluto, ricocheted over, smashed into the Earth, throwing up a gigantic cloud of dirt, dust, and debris. And when all that settled down, there were only 12 people left alive on Earth. Only 12 people left alive on Earth. Who were they, you ask? Elizabeth Taylor, Natalie Wood, Jane Russell, Susan Hayward, Marilyn Monroe, Kim Novak, Ava Gardner, Audrey Hepburn, Gina Lolo Brigida, Sophia Loren, Jane Mansfield, and me. That's what I thought about when I was in high school. So you've got to correct people when they see these things in movies and on television. And the truth is, if you look at the real records of the Atlanta campaign and get beyond the superficiality of the general's memoirs and down at what happened at the time, it seems pretty obvious that the real Confederate defeat in Georgia was Johnston's retreat out of North Georgia, not what Hood did at Atlanta. When Hood took command, the Confederates' ability to hold Atlanta had been so weakened that there was no real possibility they could do it. And when that happened, the political situation in the North changed dramatically. The Democrats had postponed their convention in Chicago until the very end of August. They figured that was about as late as they could go and still have time to organize an effective campaign. So they scheduled their convention late in August in Chicago. They adopted a platform that the war is a failure. We should open negotiations with the Confederacy, which meant for all practical purposes that we should recognize Confederate independence. We should abandon this effort to restore the Union by force. And they nominated George B. McClellan, who was back over in New Jersey. In those days, candidates did not attend the convention. They waited at home for the convention delegation to come to them and inform them officially they had been nominated. McClellan was sitting over here in New Jersey. The convention nominated McClellan. It adjourned. They came out of the convention and they ran into newsboys. Extra, extra, General Sherman has captured Atlanta. And the Democrats said, oh, fiddly-dee. Or words to that effect. And McClellan, it's interesting to look at McClellan. He's now got to go through some kind of rigmarole to explain why he should be elected since Lincoln is clearly winning the war. And eventually he came up with a kind of weaselly thing. But he lost the election, as we know, overwhelmingly in the Electoral College. A strong minority vote in the popular vote. But I recently came across an interesting election return from Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's hometown, the center of Republican strength in Illinois. You know what the vote was in Springfield in 1864? No, you shake your head. The only man in the world who does not know what the vote was in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln, 1,324 votes. McClellan, 1,314 votes. It was that close after the fall of Atlanta, after Sheridan won those victories in the Shenandoah Valley, after Early had retreated from Washington. And it seems pretty clear that the big Union success was the victory at Atlanta. It changes your perspective if you look at it that way. I grew up in Atlanta in the 1940s and 1950s. Joe Johnston was just the greatest thing since grits. But then if you start looking at more of the facts, more of what was thought at the time, more of the contemporary records, you just about conclude Joe Johnston must have been the Antichrist. He was so bad. And it was that part of the campaign that I think really determined the outcome in Georgia and the re-election of Lincoln. But as I say, there's a good book on it that you can all get and read, and I hope I have given you something to think about. Thank you very much, folks. They tell me now we have some time for questions, comments. Yes, sir. Whoa, wait a second.
Why does Sherman break his pattern of maneuver and attack at Kennesaw Mountain?
Why did Sherman break his pattern of maneuver at Kennesaw Mountain? On June 27th, at Kennesaw Mountain, which is about 25 miles north of Atlanta, northwest of Atlanta, Sherman launched a major attack, the major attack of the campaign. It was not really a major attack by 1864 standards. You have to look at the context out of which that grew. The armies had been in the area of Kennesaw Mountain for about 2.5 or 3 weeks by that time. They were held there by the fact that it rained almost every day in June of 1864 in North Georgia. fields turned into lakes of mud, roads into streams, streams into raging torrents. The armies were just pinned down, and it was very frustrating to them. They were in a position where neither side was able to do much. Johnston wasn't interested in doing much, and Sherman was bogged down. And near the end of June, probably in response to the belief that Johnston had stretched his line out so long that it was weak somewhere from north to south, that Sherman could break through. And if he did break through, then they could essentially trap a large part of the Confederate Army, which was up on top of Kennesaw Mountain, which they would, if they'd broken through, they would have been behind Kennesaw Mountain, and that part of Johnston's army would have been trapped. I think it was a rational decision on Sherman's part. The attack failed. Sherman lost about 2,500, 3,000 men. The Confederates lost about 1,000. But strategically, this turned into a great success for Sherman, because while the fighting was going on up here at Kennesaw Mountain, here's Kennesaw Mountain, left hand, way down here at the southern end of all of this, part of Sherman's army was able to get around the southern end of Johnston's army. And Johnston was so worried by the attack up here that he would not detach men to go down and oppose that breakthrough. And in that sense, in a strategic sense, Kennesaw Mountain was a victory for Sherman, because as soon as he got those men fortified, Johnston evacuated Kennesaw Mountain. I think he did it out of frustration. I think it was a rational decision, however, and if it had worked, it would have been great, and he stopped without a great number of casualties. That was not a big battle by 1864 standards. Is that anything else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, do you think that Hood could have held out at 6 months? You said he couldn't hold out a long time against Sherman, but could he have held out for 6 months until after the election?
Could he have held out? I'm sorry, if I said 6 months, I misspoke. I meant 6 weeks. Hood took command in July. The election is in November. And, you know, that's one of those hypothetical things. What would have happened if Hood's subordinates had not made the mistakes they made? Could he have held out? There's no way to tell. He certainly could have held out longer than he did, I think. But whether he could have held out until then or not, I don't know. This hypothetical thing, you know, what would have happened if the Confederates won the war? That's one of the few hypothetical what-ifs that I know the answer to. What is the, thank you, what is the, we would be speaking German with our leader, Kaiser Wilhelm XI, photograph up here. But on the good side, nobody would ever have heard of Adolf Hitler. You know, he would have remained an obscure little bohemian corporal like he was. But I think he could have held out longer. Whether it would have been the 6 months or not, I don't know. There is some speculation about this in a book called The Fourth Battle of Winchester. That is another one of those good books. Yes, sir.
So you said that you felt like that Johnston, the end kind of happened when he first started withdrawing from northern Georgia. Under the military circumstances of the size of Sherman's army and everything, the ability of Sherman to keep flanking him, what other options did Johnston have, do you think?
Okay, question was what options did Johnston have? I think he had several. The key one, I think, was to become active in his defense. I think his great weakness was he was purely passive. And for the weak side to follow a passive defense is extremely risky, because if they lose anywhere, they lose everywhere. But Johnston adopted a purely passive defense. What Johnston wanted to do was to take Confederate cavalry from other areas, notably Nathan Bedford Forrest in Mississippi, and send Forrest to destroy Sherman's rail line in Tennessee and Kentucky and North Georgia. And he got into an argument with the Confederate government because the Confederate government pointed out that Johnston, by his own reports that he sent to the Confederate government, had 8, 10, 12,000 cavalry. Why don't you use your cavalry? And Johnston refused to do it. And Jefferson Davis said, we have to hold Mississippi. That's our main source for supply there in the Tombigbee Valley. And he would not order the Confederate troops in Mississippi to go after Sherman's rail line unless Mississippi were secure. And Sherman kept sending raiding parties out from the Mississippi Valley into the state of Mississippi for the purpose of tying down Confederates there. But he could have used the kind of maneuver that Stonewall Jackson used in the Shenandoah Valley. Jackson demonstrated that an active, aggressive, small military force that maneuvers around. Johnston had that kind of terrain in North Georgia, popping in and out of mountain gaps and behind mountains and ridges, could cause a lot of trouble. And in addition to that, there were several cases during the campaign where Sherman's army was very much divided, and Johnston sat rather than trying to do something about it. Just to give you one example, at the very beginning of the campaign, Johnston's army was entrenched around Dalton, Georgia, in a position that looked a great deal like a fish hook. If you're familiar with that position on a battlefield, where an army is deployed in a fish hook kind of arrangement. And Sherman, well, I'll do it backwards again. It looks like this. Sherman had part of his army up here, part of his army here, part of his army 25 or 30 miles down here, separated by bad roads. Johnston was in the middle. He had good roads and a railroad. Why not rush troops down, fight these people down here, and then rush them back before Sherman can do it? Johnston didn't do it. He was just totally passive, which he had been all during the war. And I think it was a fatal flaw. Why he was totally passive, I don't know. It would have taken daring. He was very reluctant to take a risk. You may be familiar with Mary Chesnut and that wonderful story she tells of Johnston out bird hunting, you know, where he walked along all day and never fired a shot. Why don't you shoot, Joe? Birds are too high, birds are too low. Dogs are too near, dogs are too far. Nothing was ever right. Ruin his reputation as a marksman if he shot and missed. Better not to shoot at all. Anything else? Okay, as I say, I hope I've given you something to think about. Thank you, folks.